Here's an example. Let me write it a little better for you. It's the square root of negative 7 over the square root of negative 9 square root of negative 5. Okay, so what are we going to do with that? This is kind of a weird one, isn't it? Well, negatives inside of a square root, let's start there. Those always come out as an I, don't they? We never leave a negative inside of a square root. They always come right to the front of that root as an I. So we get I square root 7 over I square root of 9, I square root of 5. Okay. So now what? Now what are we going to do from there? Well, what we can do is we can cancel one of these i's with one of those i's. Okay, so that brings us to what result? Bring it down here, that'll leave square root of 7 on the top. And square root of 9 times I square root of 5, right? And then what we could do is say, what is that square root of 9? That's just 3. So 3i square root of 5. We good to there? Is that making sense? Okay, now they don't want us to leave i's or roots in the denominator. Let me write a note about that. Whenever we have I or square root in the denominator multiplied, let me put it a little different, with no adding or subtracting. See how there's no plus signs or minus signs or anything there? Because if you have adding or subtracting down there, that's a different deal. It's harder. You got to do something fancy. You'll see that on some of the other examples. But I'm talking about when we just have an I or a square root in the denominator with no adding or subtracting, then what do? You multiply top and bottom by the I and the root. So I'm going to come over here and just multiply top and bottom by the I and the square root of 5. Not the 3, notice. I don't mess with this. He's not a problem. We're okay with that 3 down there. You can have numbers in the denominator, of course, but not square roots. We don't like square roots in the bottom, and we don't like i's in the bottom. So you multiply top and bottom by the I and the root. Now we're doing the same thing top and bottom, so we're not going to change the fraction, right? We're just going to make it look different. And so what do we get? On the top, the root 7 and the root 5 is root 35, right? Just 7 times 5 is 35, and the I is still up there. What happens on the bottom? Well, 3i root 5 multiplies I root 5. What's going to happen? Well, 3 and the square roots multiply to be 25, and the i's multiply to be I squared. Do you see that? So, right, all I did there is I did root 5 times root 5, which made root 25, and then the 3 came right there, and then I times I made I squared. So let me bring it down here. I square root 35 over 3, and then what's the square root of 25? 5. I squared. You with me? All right, I just made that square root of 25 into 5. I just did the square root of 25, which is 5. So where does that leave us? I square root of 35. What's I squared? Do you remember what we do with I squared? That's negative 1. So it's 15 times negative 1. Let me make that more clear. That went right there. Right? You always replace I squared with negative 1. That's what we always do. And so that becomes I root 35 over negative 15. And that's a great answer right there. But there's other ways you could say it. I hope it's not confusing. It's important that I show you. Or you could say it like this. You could put the negative on the top. Or you could say it like this. You could put the negative in the front. Like that. There's three different ways you could write, and they're all the same. And notice that when you have a negative in a fraction, it doesn't really matter where that negative is, on the bottom, on the top, in the front, whatever. It's all the same thing. It's basically negative, wherever you want it to be, I root 35 over 15. So how do we do that? Let's run over that one more time. So negatives inside roots all come out as i's. These i's canceled, had one I in the bottom, and a square root on the bottom. Or actually right here. And then square root of 9 became 3. And so whenever, and here's the key step, whenever we have an I or a root in the denominator with no adding, subtracting, if you have adding, subtracting, you got to do something fancier called the conjugate. We'll get to that later. What do you do in this case? You just multiply top and bottom by the I and the root. So I said, oh, you got an I here and a root here. I root 5, so I multiplied top and bottom by I root 5. On the top became I root 35, and the bottom, the root 5 made root 25, 3, and the two i's made I squared. And then root of 25 is 5. So it became 15, and then the I squared, we always replace that with negative 1. There we go.